Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Part 4. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them, and just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, Five. Don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. 7 jogged my elbow. On which 7 looked up and said, "That's right, Five, always laying the blame on others." "You'd better not talk," said Five. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who'd spoken first. "That's none of your business, too," said 7. "Yes, it is his business," said 5, "and I'll tell him it was for bringing the crook tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brush, and it had just begun, well, of all the unjust things, when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly, and the others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me, please," said Alice a little timidly, "why you were painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find it out, well, we should all have our heads cut off, you know, so you see, miss, we're doing our best, afore she comes to—" At this moment 5, who had already been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" and the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked around, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers, and these were all ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked 2 by 2 as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and all the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and at last the grand procession came the King and the Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, thought she, if people had to lie down on their faces so that they couldn't see it? So she stood where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" And she said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice she went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing at the 3 gardeners who were lying round the rose tree, for you see, as they were lying on their faces, the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack. She could not tell whether they were gardeners, or soldiers, or courtiers, or the 3 of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and, after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, began screaming, "Off with her head! Off with her—" "Nonsense," said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his arm upon her arm, and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she is only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him, and said to the Knave, "Turn them over." The knave did so, very carefully, with one foot. "Get up," said the queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the king, the queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that," screamed the queen. "You make me giddy." And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your majesty," said Tu, in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. "We were trying—" "I see," said the queen, who meanwhile had been examining the roses. "Off with their heads." And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them in a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered around for a minute or 2, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the queen. "Their heads are gone, if it please your majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," shouted the queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent, and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on then," roared the queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. "It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the white rabbit, who was peering anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the rabbit in a low, hurried voice. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself up on tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'What's a pity'?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, 'What for?'" "She boxed the queen's ears," the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush," said the rabbit, whispered in a frightened tone. "The queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the queen said—" "Get your places," shouted the queen in a voice of thunder, and the people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or 2, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm, with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as it had got its neck straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself around and look at her face with such a puzzled expression she could not help but burst out laughing. And when she'd got its head down, it was going to begin again. It was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or a furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and it was doubled, as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground. Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting for turns, quarrelling all the while, and fighting for the hedgehogs. In a very short time the queen was in a furious passion, and went stamping about, shouting, "Off with his head, off with her head," about once every minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy, to be sure. She had not yet had any dispute with the queen, but she knew it might happen at any minute. And then, thought she, what will become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape, and wondering whether she'd get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or 2 she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have someone to talk to." "How are you getting on?" said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited until the eyes appeared, and then nodded. It's no use speaking to it, she thought, till its ears have come through, or at least one of them has. In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was more than enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think that they play it all fairly," Alice began in a rather complaining tone, "and they quarrel all so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak. And they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if they are, nobody attends to them. And you've no idea how confusing it all, the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground. And I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the Queen?" said the cat in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" Just then she noticed the Queen was so close behind her, listening, so she went on, "likely to win the game, that it's hardly worth finishing." The Queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the King, coming up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the King. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," said the cat. "Don't be impertinent," said the King, "and don't look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed," said the King very decidedly, and then he called to the Queen, who was passing at the moment. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The Queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with its head," she said, without even looking around. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the King eagerly, and hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going, as she heard the Queen's voice in the distance screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence of 3 players to be executed for having missing their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in much confusion, so that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went off in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice to be an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across to the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she'd caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over, and both hedgehogs were out of sight. But it doesn't matter much, thought Alice, as all the archers are gone from this side of the ground. So she tucked it away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friend. But when she got back, the Cheshire cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the King, and the Queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all 3 to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her, as though they all spoke at once. She found it very hard to make out exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, and that he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The King's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The Queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all round. It was this last remark that had made the whole party look so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say, but "It belongs to the Duchess. You'd better ask her about it." "She's in prison," the Queen said to the executioner. "Fetch her here." And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he'd come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared, so the King and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. Chapter 9. The Mock Turtle Story. "You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing," said the Duchess, as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself perhaps that it was only the pepper in the kitchen that had made her so savage when they'd met. When I am a duchess, she said to herself, not in a very hopeful tone though, I won't have any pepper in my kitchen at all. Soup does very well without. Maybe it's always pepper that makes people hot-tempered. She went on, very much pleased at having found out a new kind of rule, and vinegar that makes them sour, and chamomile that makes them bitter, and barley sugar, and such things that make children sweet-tempered. I only wish people knew that. Then they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know. She'd quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. You're thinking about something, my dear, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is, but I shall remember it in a bit. Perhaps it hasn't had one, Alice ventured to remark. Tut, tut, child, said the Duchess. Everything's got a moral, if only you can find it. And she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice did not much like her keeping so close, at first, because the Duchess was very ugly, and second, because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin on Alice's shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she did not like to be rude, so she bore it as well as she could. The game's going on rather better now, she said, by way of keeping up the conversation a little. 'Tis so, said the Duchess, and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love that makes the world go round. Somebody said, Alice whispered, that it is done by everybody minding their own business. Ah, well, it means much the same thing, said the Duchess, digging her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder, as she added, and the moral of that is, take care of the sense and the sound will take care of themselves. How fond she is of finding morals in things, Alice thought to herself. I dare say you're wondering why I don't put my arm round your waist, the Duchess said after a pause. The reason is I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo. Shall I try the experiment? He might bite, Alice replied cautiously, not feeling at all anxious to have the experiment tried. Very true, said the Duchess. Flamingos and mustard both bite, and the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together. Only mustard isn't a bird, Alice remarked. Right, as usual, said the Duchess. What a clear way you have of putting things. It's a mineral, I think, said Alice. Of course it is, said the Duchess, who seemed ready to agree with everything Alice said. There's a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours. Oh, I know, exclaimed Alice, who had not attended to this last remark. It's a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is. I quite agree with you, said the Duchess. And the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or, if you like it, put more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to be others, that you were or might have been. What was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise. I think I should have understood that better, Alice said very politely, if I had it written down, but I can't quite follow it, as you say it. That's nothing as to what I could say if I chose, the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. Pray, don't trouble yourself to say it any longer than that, said Alice. Oh, don't talk about trouble, said the Duchess. I'll make you a present of everything I've said as yet. A cheap sort of present, thought Alice. I'm glad people don't give birthday presents like that. But she did not venture to say that out loud. Thinking again, said the Duchess asked, with another dig of her sharp little chin. I've a right to think, said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to feel a little worried. Just about as much right as the Duchess, as pigs have to fly, and that the moral. But here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away even in the middle of her favourite word moral, and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the Queen in front of them, with arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. "A fine day, Your Majesty," the Duchess began in a low, weak voice. "Now, I give you fair warning," shouted the Queen, stamping her foot on the ground as she spoke. "Either you or your head must be off, and in about half to no time. Take your choice." The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment. "Let's get on with the game," said the Queen to Alice, and Alice was much too frightened to say a word, but slowly followed her back to the croquet ground. The other guests had taken advantage of the Queen's absence and were resting in the shade. However, the moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game, the Queen merely remarking that a moment's delay could cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the Queen never left off quarrelling with the other players and shouting, "Off with his head! Off with her head!" Those whom she had sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers, who of course had to leave off being archers to do this, so that by the end of a half-hour or so there were no archers left, and all the players except the King, Queen, and Alice were in custody and under sentence of execution. And then the Queen left off, quite out of breath, and said to Alice, "Have you seen the Mock Turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "It's the thing mock turtle soup is made from," said the Queen. "I never saw one, or heard of one," said Alice. "Come on then," said the Queen, "and he shall tell you his history." As they walked off together, Alice heard the King say in a low voice to the company generally, "You're all pardoned." "Come, that's a good thing," she said to herself, for she had felt quite unhappy at the number of executions the Queen had ordered. They very soon came upon a griffin, lying fast asleep in the sun. If you don't know what a griffin is, look at the picture. "Up, lazy thing," said the Queen, "and take this young lady to go and see the Mock Turtle, and to hear its history. I must go back and see after some executions I've ordered." And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the griffin. Alice did not quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole she thought it would be safe to stay with it as to go with the savage Queen, so she waited. The griffin sat up and rubbed its eyes, then watched the Queen till she was out of sight, then chuckled. "What fun!" said the griffin, half to itself and to Alice. "What is the fun?" said Alice. "Why, she," said the griffin. "It's all her fancy, that. They never execute anybody, you know. Come on." "Everybody says come on here," thought Alice as she went slowly after it. "I was never so ordered about in my life, never." They had not gone far before they saw the Mock Turtle in the distance, sitting sad and lonely on a little ledge of rock. As they came nearer, Alice could hear him sighing as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply. "What is his sorrow?" she asked the griffin, and the griffin answered, very nearly in the same words as before, "It's all his fancy, that. He hasn't got no sorrow, you know. Come on." So they went up to the Mock Turtle. He looked at them with large eyes full of tears, but said nothing. "This here young lady," said the griffin, "she wants to know what your history, she do?" "I'll tell it to her," said the Mock Turtle in a deep, hollow tone. "Sit down, both of you, and don't speak a word till I've finished." So they sat down, and nobody spoke for some minutes. Alice thought to herself, "I don't see how he can ever finish if he doesn't begin." But she waited patiently. "Once," said the Mock Turtle at last, with a deep sigh, "I was a real turtle." These words were followed by a very long silence, broken only by an occasional exclamation of "Hurk!" from the griffin, and a constant heavy sobbing of the Mock Turtle. Alice was very nearly getting up and saying, "Thank you, sir, for your interesting story," but she could not help thinking there must be more to come, so she sat and said nothing. "When we were little," the Mock Turtle went on at last, more calmly, though still sobbing a little now and then, "we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise." "Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?" Alice asked. "We called him Tortoise because he taught us," the Mock Turtle replied angrily. "Really, you are very dull." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself asking such simple questions," added the griffin, and then they both sat silent and looked at poor Alice, who felt ready to sink into the earth. At last the griffin said to the Mock Turtle, "Drive on, old fellow, don't be all day about it." And he went on in these words, "Yes, we went to school in the sea, though you mayn't believe it." "I never said I didn't," interrupted Alice. "You did," said the Mock Turtle. "Hold your tongue," added the griffin, before Alice could speak again. The Mock Turtle went on. "We had the best of educations. In fact, we were sent to school every day." "I've been to a day school too," said Alice. "You needn't be so proud as all of that." "With extras?" asked the Mock Turtle a little anxiously. "Yes," said Alice. "We learned French and music." "And washing?" said the Mock Turtle. "Certainly not," said Alice indignantly. "Ah, then yours wasn't a really good school," said the Mock Turtle in a tone of relief. "Now at ours they had, at the end of the bill, French music and washing extra. You couldn't have wanted it much, said Alice, living at the bottom of the sea. I couldn't afford to learn it, said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. I only took the regular course. What was that? Inquired Alice. Reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with, the Mock Turtle replied, and then the different branches of arithmetic, ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. I've never heard of uglification, Alice ventured to say. What is that? The Gryphon lifted up both its paws in surprise. Never heard of uglifying, it exclaimed. You know what it is to beautify, I suppose. Yes, said Alice doubtfully. I mean, it means to make anything prettier? Well then, said the Gryphon went on, if you don't know what to uglify is, you are a simpleton. Alice did not feel encouraged to ask any more questions about it, so she turned to the Mock Turtle and said, What else had you to learn? Well, there was a mystery, the Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects on his flappers. Mystery, ancient and modern, with seaography, and then drawling. And then drawling master was an old codger eel that used to come once a week. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils. What was that like? Asked Alice. Well, I can't show it to you myself, the Mock Turtle said. I'm too stiff, and the Gryphon never learnt it. Hadn't time, said the Gryphon. I went to the classical master, though. He was an old crab, he was. I never went to him, said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. He taught laughing and grief, they used to say. So he did, said the Gryphon, sighing in his turn, and both creatures hid their faces in their paws. And how many hours a day did you do lessons? Said Alice in a hurry to change the subject. 10 hours on the first day, said the Mock Turtle, 9 on the next, and so on. What a curious plan, exclaimed Alice. That's the reason they're called lessons, said the Gryphon, because they lessen from day to day. That was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her remark. Then the 11th day must have been a holiday? Of course it was, said the Mock Turtle. And how did you manage on the 12th? Alice went on eagerly. That's enough about lessons, the Gryphon interrupted in a very decided tone. Tell her something about the games now. Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flapper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a moment or two sobs choked his voice. Same as if it had bone to his throat, said the Gryphon, and set to work shaking him and punching him in the back. At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears running down his cheeks he went on again. You may not have lived much under the sea. I haven't, said Alice, and perhaps you were never even once introduced to a lobster. Alice began to say, I once tasted, but checked herself hastily and said, no, never. And so you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is. No, indeed, said Alice. What sort of dance is it? Why, said the Gryphon, you first form a line along the seashore. 2 lines, cried the Mock Turtle. Seals, turtles, salmons, and so on. And then when you've cleared all the jellyfish out of the way, that generally takes some time, interrupted the Gryphon. You advance twice, each with a lobster as a partner, cried the Gryphon. Of course, said the Mock Turtle. Advance twice, set to partners, change lobsters, and retire in the same order, continued the Gryphon. Then, you know, the Mock Turtle went on. You throw the lobsters, shouted the Gryphon with a bound into the air. As far out to sea as you can. Swim after them, screamed the Gryphon. Turn a somersault in the sea, cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about. Change lobsters again, yelled the Gryphon at the top of its voice. Back again to land, and that's the first figure, said the Mock Turtle, suddenly dropping its voice, and the 2 creatures who'd been jumping about like mad things all this time sat down again, very sadly and quietly, and looked at Alice. It must be a very pretty dance, said Alice timidly. Would you like to see a little of it? Said the Mock Turtle. Very much indeed, said Alice. Come, let's try the first figure, said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon. We can do without lobsters, you know. What shall we sing? Oh, you sing, said the Gryphon. I've forgotten the words. So they began solemnly dancing round and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close, waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and sadly. "Will you walk a little faster?" said a whiting to a snail. "There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you, won't you, join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you, won't you, join the dance?" You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us with the lobsters out to sea. But the snail replied, too far, and gave a look askance. Said he thanked the whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, would not join the dance. "What matters how far we go?" his scaly friend replied. "There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. Further off from England, the nearer is to France. They turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance?" "Thank you. It's a very interesting dance to watch," said Alice, feeling glad that it was over at last. "And I do sort of like that curious song about the whiting." "Oh, as to the whiting," said the Mock Turtle. You've seen them, of course." "Yes," said Alice. "I've often seen them at She checked herself hastily. "I don't know where Din may be," said the Mock Turtle, "but if you've seen them so often, of course, you'll know what they're like." "I believe so," replied Alice thoughtfully. "They have their tails in their mouths, and they're all over in crumbs." "You're wrong about the crumbs," said the Mock Turtle. "Crumbs would wash off in the sea, but they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is—" Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes. "Tell her about the reason and all that," he said to the Gryphon. "The reason is," said the Gryphon, "that they would go with the lobsters to the dance, so they got thrown out to sea, so they had to fall a long way, so they got their tails fast in their mouths, so they couldn't get them out again. That's all." "Thank you," said Alice. "It's very interesting. I never knew so much about whiting before." "I can tell you more than that if you'd like," said the Gryphon. "Do you know why it's called a whiting?" "I never thought about it," said Alice. "Why?" "It does the boots and shoes," the Gryphon replied very solemnly. Alice was thoroughly puzzled. "Does the boots and shoes?" she replied in a wondering tone. "Why, what are your shoes done with?" said the Gryphon. "I mean, what makes them so shiny?" Alice looked down at them and considered a little before she gave her answer. "They're done with blacking, I believe." "Boots and shoes under the sea," said the Gryphon, went on in a deep voice, "are done with whiting. Now you know." "And what are they made of?" Alice asked in a tone of great curiosity. "Soles and eels, of course," the Gryphon replied rather impatiently. "Any shrimp could have told you that." "If I'd been a whiting," said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on with the song, "I'd have said to the porpoise, 'Keep back, please, we don't want you with us.'" "They were obliged to have him with them," the Mock Turtle said. "No wise fish would go anywhere without purpose." "Wouldn't it really?" said Alice in a tone of great surprise. "Why, of course not," said the Mock Turtle. "Why, if a fish came to see me and told me he was going on a journey, I would say, 'With what purpose?'" "Don't you mean purpose?" "I mean what I say," said the Mock Turtle, replied in an offended tone. And the Gryphon added, "Come, let's hear some of your adventures." "I could tell you my adventures, beginning from this morning," said Alice a little timidly, "but it's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a different person then." "Explain all that," said the Mock Turtle. No, adventures first," said the Gryphon in an impatient tone. "Explanation take such a dreadful time." So Alice began telling them her adventures from the time when she first saw the White Rabbit. She was a little nervous about it, just at first. The two creatures got close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide. But she gained courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet till she got to the part about her repeating, "You are old, Father William," to the caterpillar, and the words coming out all different. And then the Mock Turtle took a long breath and said, "That's very curious." "It's all about as curious as it can be," said the Gryphon. "It all came different," the Mock Turtle repeated thoughtfully. "I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin." He looked at the Gryphon as though it had some kind of authority over Alice. "Stand up and repeat. 'Tis the voice of the sluggard." "How the creatures order one about and make one repeat lessons," thought Alice. "I might just as well be at school at once." However, she got up and began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the lobster quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying, and the words came very queer indeed. "'Tis the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "You have baked me too brown, I must sugar my hair." As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he's gay as a lark, and will talk in tempestuous tones of the shark. But when the tides rise and the sharks are around, his voice has a timid and tremulous sound. "That's different from what I used to say when I was a child," said the Gryphon. "Well, I've never heard it before," said the Mock Turtle, "but it sounds uncommon nonsense." Alice said nothing. She had sat down with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in the natural way again. "I should like to have it explained," said the Mock Turtle. "She can't explain it," said the Gryphon hastily. "Go on with the next verse." "But about his toes," persisted the Mock Turtle. "How could he turn them out with his nose, do you know?" "It's the first position in dancing," Alice said, but she was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing, and longed to change the subject. "Go on with the next verse," said the Gryphon, repeated. "It begins, 'I passed by his garden.'" Alice did not dare disobey, though she felt sure it would come out all wrong, and she went on with a trembling voice. "I passed by his garden, and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took pie crust and gravy and meat, while the owl had the dish as his share of the treat. When the pie was full finished, the owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received the knife and the fork with a growl, and concluded the banquet by—" "What is the use of repeating all that stuff," the Mock Turtle interrupted, "if you don't explain it as you go on? It's by far the most confusing thing I've ever heard." "Yes, I think you'd better leave off," said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. "Shall we try another figure of the lobster quadrille?" said the Gryphon. "Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you another song?" "Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind," Alice replied, so eagerly that the Gryphon, in a rather offended tone, "No accounting for tastes. Sing her turtle soup, will you, old fellow?" The Mock Turtle sighed deeply, and began in a voice choked with sobs to sing this: "Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen, for who such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup, soup of the evening, beautiful soup, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for 2 pennyworth only of beautiful soup? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup." "Chorus again!" cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it when a cry of "The trial's beginning!" was heard in the distance. "Come on!" cried the Gryphon, and taking Alice by the hand, he hurried off, without waiting for the end of the song. "What trial is it?" Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered, "Come on!" and they ran faster, while more and more faintly, carried on the breeze that followed them, the melancholy words, "Soup of the evening, beautiful soup."